Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast. Are you ready for Third Wave DEI? Sponsored by InfoPro Learning. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credit. You will receive an email from hr.com within 2 business days. It will include the certification credit information. You may also log into your account and view the credits that you have received. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on Q&A in your webinar controls and type them in. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Dan Rust.
Hello, everybody. Let me just very briefly introduce myself before we get into the actual content of the program. I do think some of my background is relevant in terms of the context for this program overall. And we'll be talking about what exactly is Third Wave DEI. And to be honest, it's just a term I started using a while back because I was seeing a distinct shift in the DEI training landscape. So we'll talk about that. But I'm Dan Rust. I am the Vice President of Global Leadership Development and Talent Management for InfoPro Learning. My background, you can see on the screen here, goes a fair ways back. My formal education is in nuclear engineering. I was a nuclear submariner, nuclear reactor operator for the U.S. Navy. Transitioning out of the military, I moved into a series of internal corporate training leadership roles. And in terms of the DEI space, I work with a team of researchers, developers, instructional designers for InfoPro Learning, who focus in on not just diversity, equity, inclusion, but in the leadership landscape overall. And then we have thought leaders within our organization who focus specifically on DEI. And while InfoPro Learning has a broad library of leadership development courses that are continuously refreshed and updated, within that library, we have what we call our DEI suite of programs, including content on unconscious bias in the workplace, inclusive leadership, leading across cultures and generations. And the reason I share this with you is because I'm having conversations every week with individuals who are responsible for diversity education initiatives within their organizations. I talk to chief diversity officers, I talk to directors of diversity, directors of culture, whatever the titles may be. Every week I'm having these conversations. So I do feel like I'm in a somewhat unique spot to keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the real world of DEI in the corporate world, in the corporate space. And so in that real world, one of the things I have noticed, because I've had people ask questions about, hey, what do I see shifting in the DEI landscape? And I started to use this term Third Wave DEI as a way of acknowledging that there have been significant waves of progress, waves of activity. And I'm going to walk you through, just to set the foundation, to set the context, I'm going to walk you through what I refer to as Wave 1 and Wave 2 before we get to Wave 3. And full transparency, these are just personal perspectives. It is my way of thinking. It's what I'm personally observing. So I don't have some huge research base to back this up. It's just, again, when I keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening, this is what I've seen and experienced, and this is what I'm seeing and experiencing right now as we speak. So to talk first about Wave 1, we do have to go back a ways. What I call Wave 1 of workplace diversity training began in the United States in the 1960s. And for those of you who are global and you're joining beyond the United States, I just want to say I openly acknowledge my point of view tends to be a U.S.-centric point of view because that's where my experience lies. So I'm going to speak mostly to that, although I do think much of what I'm sharing with you is reflected globally as well. The timelines may be slightly different, but certainly what's happened is still relevant. In the 1960s, as a reaction to the civil rights movement, the protests and demonstrations, and the national media attention that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it became illegal for businesses with more than 15 employees to discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And according to the law as it was written, they couldn't discriminate in hiring, termination, promotion, compensation, job training, or any other what was called term, condition, or privilege of employment. But of course, many businesses did discriminate, and a large number of discrimination lawsuits were filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the United States. This resulted in severe financial penalties and the EEOC requiring that the sanctioned organizations train all of their employees in anti-discriminatory behavior. And then at that point, the workplace diversity training movement was essentially born. Now, to be fair, there certainly had been some workplace diversity and racial sensitivity training before this, but not on a large scale. But in the US military, those of you who are of an age where you either can remember back or you are familiar with the era, this was the Vietnam War era. And the US military essentially needed thousands of poor Black and white soldiers to work together. So they employed what they called encounter groups at the platoon level with essentially this message: hey, you work together to combat a common enemy or you die. That essentially was the message. And it was perhaps the largest scale diversity education experiment ever conducted. And it was to a large degree successful. It turns out the threat of death is a diversity training motivator when you're a soldier in the trenches in Vietnam. But the non-military workplace diversity training, it wasn't just driven by companies that were being sanctioned by the EEOC. It was all the other companies that wanted to avoid the severe penalties and sanctions. And so naturally, most of the initial diversity training efforts in the 60s centered on legislation and compliance. Obviously, companies wanted to avoid costly and embarrassing lawsuits and negative publicity. And so many voluntarily implemented training focused on imparting information on the legal requirements to their managers and their rank and file employees. And I've looked at some of the training from this era. And while I am in my own way, middle-aged to slightly beyond middle-aged white guy, I wasn't in the work world in the 1960s, but I have had a chance to look at a fair amount of the training from that era. And there were basically two approaches. The most common was essentially a compliance lecture. Let's bring everyone into a room for 4 hours, tell them the new law or new laws, plus the company policies, plus a lot of do's and don'ts, and maybe a couple of case studies. We do this once, we check off the box, and we move on. The other kind of diversity training was extremely confrontational, very emotional, and I'm sorry to say, in many cases, kind of racist itself. It kind of went like this. Okay, everybody, read the pages. We want you to fill in the blanks. Black people are blank. White people are blank. Asians are blank. Now, after you filling all of those out, now share your results so we can all tell you what a racist piece of garbage you are. It's a little hyperbole, but yes, honestly, if you're familiar with the Office sitcoms Diversity Day training, in the 60s, sometimes it wasn't too far off from that. So the actual efficacy of the training wasn't always that great in the 60s. Driven more by passion and fear than by actual research into what ultimately is effective in changing behaviors and mindsets. Now, with that said, in the 70s, the workplace diversity training landscape definitely evolved. There were marches and protests and intense political activism focused on women's rights. Racial and gender diversity in the workplace was expanding rapidly. There was a period of intense government enforcement of the Civil Rights Act, particularly sex or gender discrimination against women. But at the same time, we should not forget that the Equal Rights Amendment was not ratified at the time. In the early 70s, federal agencies took the first step toward what I would call modern day diversity training. And by the end of 1971, the Social Security Administration had enrolled over 50,000 employees through racial bias training. Corporations followed suit, and over the next 5 years, they began offering anti-bias training to their employees on a large scale, so that by 1976, 60% of large companies were offering equal opportunity training of some kind. Affirmative action became widespread, and while this was progress, it was still also true that the underlying corporate driver for the training was compliance and avoidance of costly sanctions. And the actual training methodology was shifting, with a lot of research being conducted regarding what was and was not effective in shifting behaviors and mindsets. So then moving into the 80s, at this point, affirmative action was at its height, and many companies utilized independent diversity professionals to provide programs to help increase the numbers of African Americans and women employees. Many organizations still utilize diversity training to safeguard against civil rights lawsuits. And much of the training focused primarily on Black and white racial issues and sexism. But there was a growing attention given to discrimination based on sexual orientation. But still little or no attention was given to Latino, Asian, age discrimination, or people with disabilities. And the business case in those days emphasized diversity as kind of doing the right thing, as opposed to being a true business imperative, being a true business driver. It wasn't viewed as, hey, this is what drives creativity, this is what drives synergy, this is how we include everyone to get better ideas, to get better innovation. It was simply more from a moral standpoint. We're going to do this to do the right thing. Also in the 80s, this was when the higher education sector started offering diversity courses in the general education curricula. Many professors began to interweave cultural differences into developmental, social, and cognitive psychology courses. However, workplace diversity training did stall out a bit in the 80s. President Reagan's deregulation policies that were designed to spur business growth and boost the lagging economy, they also had the effect of removing the compliance stick that had motivated many company diversity initiatives. And the EEOC, under Clarence Thomas now in the 80s, began to de-emphasize compliance agreements that had included goals and timetables for increasing representation of underrepresented groups, and to allow employers a little more leeway. The result, though, was less of a push to diversify, and the training became a line item that could be reduced as part of cost-cutting efforts in an era when offshore competition was heating up. So there was kind of a push and pull related to diversity training in the 80s. And at this point, those companies that continued to push diversity training, they shifted their strategy because it wasn't as compliance driven. There wasn't as much of a fear of government intervention. So the companies that were advocating for diversity training, they aimed to provide content that would help women and people of color assimilate into the existing corporate cultures, based on the assumption that these new people in the corporate world were less prepared because they had not yet developed the necessary managerial skills to be effective managers. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just observing that when I look at diversity training from that period of time, it seems to be more about, hey, we'll help them develop skills and capabilities to fill their gaps. So it was more about training them and less about facilitating change in the majority At least I see this in some of the programs and materials from that time. And then we move into the 90s, and I'll accelerate this a bit here. So we're not going to go, decade by decade, but we move into the 90s, and we do see another shift. First of all, in the 90s, the actual demographic makeup of the workforce was beginning a huge shift. Baby boomer retirements, increased immigration, the entrance of more women and ethnic minorities into the workforce meant that workforce diversity was becoming a fact of life for organizations. It was not just a government-driven mandate. The corporate world now, whether the government was involved or not, the corporate world had to pay real attention to how having different backgrounds and experiences would impact the ability of the dominant group and the new minority groups to work together effectively. And there was significant expansion and variety of diversity training initiatives to focus on barriers to inclusion for other identity groups, from ability difference, ethnic, religious, gay, lesbian, and other worldviews. All of this began to appear in workforce education and training materials and programs at that time. And from there, in the 90s, we transitioned into the 2000s and really the first 2 decades of the new millennia. And I have to say, there was certainly progress in the first 20 years of the 2010s up to 2020. But for that 20-ish year period, there was slow incremental development and more of a reaction to the reality that the workforce was evolving, the workforce was changing. But what was also changing at that time was our technology-enabled workforce. So diversity training in those first 2 decades of the 2000s made a huge shift toward leveraging e-learning. And e-learning became the primary vehicle for receiving your annual sexual harassment training, your annual diversity sensitivity training. And the good news is far more people were exposed to diversity training in those 2 decades. The bad news is the training itself became less personal, less engaging, and the intent of the visual isn't so much going nowhere, but it doesn't seem like there was a huge amount of progress. It was every year we check out the box. We do our anti-harassment training. We do our training, and we kind of reached a bit of a place where there were other things to think about. There were other priorities, and this in conjunction with the fact that with new technology, the overall flow of work was increasing. So we were exposed, not just in the workplace, but we were exposed in our entire lives through social media and other elements to lots of other messaging related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it was no longer just the workplace environment that was delivering our quote unquote training. It was the media overall. And having talked to and had conversations with a fair number of diversity professionals who were in the workforce at that time, I will say one of the overarching themes of my conversations with them was that we continue to do this, and yet our employee engagement scores don't change. People are still unhappy. In fact, things were trending slightly downward or dramatically downward. And in fact, if you combine, to get to this graph, I combined 4 different employee engagement surveys over the last 20 years. And no matter how much was poured into diversity training, engagement training, inclusion development, inclusion training, employees, it seems, were consistently feeling less and less and less engaged and included in the workplace. And when I also have these conversations with the folks who are responsible or were responsible in those first 2 decades of the 2000s, a lot of them tell me they felt alone. They didn't have a lot of colleagues that they could turn to, that they could go to. There was a sense of, okay, we've landed in a place now where we know what diversity training is, we know what sexual harassment training is, we know the do's, we know the don'ts, we know, so we all kind of know this, and yet we get retrained every year. So sometimes it felt like Groundhog Day. All right, it's January. Let's get through all of our, annual compliance training, and let's do that again and again. And I have had conversations with some HR professionals who've said they kind of lost their mojo during some of those years because it did start to feel like Groundhog Day. Not that there wasn't progress, not that there wasn't good work done, not that the work wasn't important. But then things did change in May of 2020 with George Floyd's death, with George Floyd's murder, and with all of the reaction and riots that sprang from George Floyd's murder. Something dramatically shifted in the corporate diversity training landscape. The first thing that shifted dramatically was the willingness of large companies to make huge commitments regarding what they were going to do in this space. So you suddenly had postings for chief diversity officers, chief equity officers, chief equality officers. Lots and lots of people were hired in the aftermath of those George Floyd riots. Lots of companies made huge financial commitments, huge investments in I'm sorry, I'm reading the chats as well. I'm not sure if someone has a challenge with my visuals. I apologize if you've got some challenge with the visuals. I'm not. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to ignore the chats for a bit because I can't edit myself and deliver this at exactly the same time. The point that I'm trying to make is the intense shift from the corporate world into willingness to invest back. There was a palpable energy that sprang from this, and I view that as the George Floyd aftermath was in fact wave 2 of diversity training, where there was a reinvestment, there was a re-intensity, and there was a lot of activity and commitment and a lot of high-minded and fantastically sounding messages coming from major corporations throughout the world. And when I talk about wave 3 DEI, I can't really point to a particular place in time or point in time when the change occurred or when the third wave DEI started. I don't think there is one particular point in time. I just noticed in the last 6 months, maybe 8 months, suddenly the intensity, the investments, even the positions. I've talked to friends and acquaintances who have been laid off, who were in chief diversity officer positions or diversity leadership positions, and I've had situations where friends have moved from one organization to another, and then their old position wasn't replaced. It was viewed as an opportunity to scale that position down. So it does seem to me that corporate investments in DEI are scaling back. The intensity in DEI is scaling back, and ultimately something is happening in this third wave where we're seeing an expansion of focus beyond race, beyond gender, beyond sexual orientation. We're seeing a view more toward the full diversity of humanity. So while we're trying to do more and create a broader shift in mindsets, we're actually seeing lower investments. And here are some of the when I talk to organizations about what they're seeing in their employees and what they're experiencing with their leaders, what employees are telling us in this third wave is they want more. They want more empathy from their leadership. They want more growth opportunities. Employees are looking for a high growth trajectory from the very beginning. They're not willing to put in 10 years or 20 years before they get their first significant promotion. They want their first significant promotion within months. I mean, they have a much tighter timeline expectation. Employees are looking for a very fair work/reward contract. And whatever your definition or their definition of fairness is, it's a word that they're using a lot. They want a fair reward for the work that's being done. They are rejecting anything that's being perceived as menial or mundane work. So if the work isn't linked to some important purpose or isn't linked into an important mission of the business, it's hard to find employees who are willing to do or want to do that mundane work. And we've been hearing about work-life balance for a long time, for decades, but there has been a shift that's occurred where it's no longer just something that you talk about perhaps after you've been hired and you wait 6 months and then you get a little overworked and you begin to have gentle conversations about the need for work-life balance. It's now part of the interview process. The interviewees are bringing this up. The interviewees want to know that the company is committed to work-life balance. Well-being and mental health is something that employees are much more comfortable talking about now than they were perhaps a decade or two ago. So there's a big shift that's occurring in terms of employee expectations within their organizations. And yet when I talk to leaders will tell me, all right, so I'm caught in this vice grip because all of my old accountabilities still exist. I'm still expected to produce the same business results. I'm still expected to produce the same outcomes. And yet, while I'm doing that, I'm also expected to cultivate the engagement of all of my employees. I'm expected to be an agile thinker. I'm expected to lead with inclusion and involve everybody in the conversation and the culture of the organization. I'm expected to be emotionally effective, to create psychological safety. I'm expected to be a different kind of person while also producing the results that I was always intended to produce or required to produce. And there is a huge amount of stress on leaders today when it comes to this third wave of DEI. And I'm not saying I have some huge, fantastic answer to this. What I'm saying is I have conversations about these stressors every single week with either employees about their expectations or with leaders about the pressures that they are under. And I see a number of things shifting in the diversity training landscape. While it's still important to address racial diversity, gender issues, sexual orientation issues, more and more what I'm seeing is programs that look at the entire realm of human diversity, from neurodiversity to family status, ensuring that those employees who have large families are attended to, and those employees who have no families, employees who are planning families, those employees who are planning to never have children. All of those differences are being incorporated into the fuller context, the full dimension of human diversity, looking at people's backgrounds, looking introverts versus extroverts, looking at this entire range, which again can start to feel overwhelming. And one of the undercurrents of this is having employees who are within some of those original groups start to wonder, well, are we losing focus on the importance of racial inclusion? Are we losing focus on the importance of gender equity? Are we losing focus on the importance of sexual orientation, equity and inclusion? And it's a fair question. as we expand the aperture to include all of these variations. I had an employee a couple of weeks ago say to me, well, if in the end we are all part of the inclusive message, then does that water down the original core messages that we were trying to deliver? And it's a fair question. I don't have an answer. I just know that I'm seeing this expansion of the overall messaging related to diversity and inclusion. I'm also seeing, when I talk to organizations about their leadership models and their leadership competency models, many organizations are taking another look at their classic leadership competency model and determining that there does need to be an evolution. If we're looking for a different kind of leader, if we have a different kind of organization, if we have a different kind of employee, inclusivity is becoming a core leadership competency. And so if we just focus in on inclusivity for a moment, inclusivity can mean a lot of things. It's one of those terms that everybody can create their own sort of mental definition of what inclusivity is. But just basing my point of view on the conversations that I've been having for the last year and a half to 2 years, there seem to be 6 critical core elements of an inclusive leader. And it does begin with self-awareness, becoming aware of one's own tendencies toward biases, and not just racial, gender, sexual orientation bias, but our entire sense of blind spots that can ultimately lead us down erroneous paths. So leaders who take the time to question their own thinking, to question their own point of view, and that it's not a one and done, that it's an ongoing process. It is a challenge because we want leaders to be confident, but we also want them to be self-questioning. We want leaders to have a strong point of view, but we want them to be flexible in their strong point of view and be open to the perspectives of others. So I think we are in the process, in this, again, what I call third wave of DEI, figuring this out. How do we handle these natural tensions between being confident and also being humble and open? And what do we mean by leadership empathy? I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of conversations to be had regarding strong, empathetic leadership that does create direction, that does drive a vision, that does move an organization forward, and at the same time has a strong sense of empathy for everyone within that organization and all of the other stakeholders as well, including customers, including investors, everyone. The other elements I see in inclusive leadership are what I call congruent communication, meaning virtually the opposite of one and done communication. What I see in high performing inclusive leaders is that their inclusive leadership message is not just what they say. And it's not just a one-time message that they send out, or once a quarter message, or once a year message. It's what they say and what they do. So inclusive leaders are those leaders who in web meetings, when they have their team in a web meeting, they don't just attend to an individual person's point of view. They understand that it's important that they pull everyone into the conversations, that they pull everyone into the decisions, that they do in their manner of operating day in and day out. They act inclusively. They don't just talk inclusively. So that's what I mean by congruent communication, that your actions are congruent with your words day in and day out, not just a one-time event, but day in and day out throughout your work day, throughout your work world. What I mean by dimensional intelligence is, going back when we talk about the full dimension of humanity, to be an effective leader today, to be an inclusive leader today, you do have to have at least a baseline understanding. When we talk about neurodiversity, what does that mean? An inclusive leader has to have an understanding of the full range of human dimension and understand what is different about individuals who have made the choice to never have children themselves, versus what is different about individuals who've had a military background, versus individuals who've had a nonprofit background, versus individuals in various cultures, and it can be overwhelming. And we're not asking any particular leader to instantly become fully educated on every culture, every difference, every situation, but over time, in an ongoing continuous learning effort, leaders do have to develop dimensional intelligence to be and not expect their employees to do all the education for them. You can't expect your employees to come to you to say, hey, look, I know you're not familiar with my culture or you're not familiar with my heritage. Let me educate you. That's really not fair to the employees as well. So leaders do have to take this on as a role in terms of developing that full dimensional intelligence over time. Then the final two elements of these inclusive leadership competencies, we know that we're not always going to get it right. And leaders who are able to adapt and be resilient and not be worried about occasionally making missteps, not be worried about occasionally not phrasing something exactly in the right way or in the way that won't in some way trigger someone else or offend someone else. Leaders have to know that they will in this journey make mistakes. Their teams will in this journey make mistakes. And having that ability to be resilient, to learn, to adapt is an incredible important part of being an inclusive leader, because as we all head down this journey, we're all figuring it out together. And I do believe then the final competency for an inclusive leader is what we call synergistic engagement. And I think this is ultimately the reason why businesses will support highly inclusive leaders, because if you can, in fact, synergize the inputs of all of your employees, of your entire team, if you can, in fact, create a space where the ideas, the backgrounds, the perspectives, the points of view of all employees have a space, is the ultimate key to why business should care about this. There is a business imperative to inclusive leadership. So again, mastering that and figuring out how do I do all of these other things that we've been talking about while also leveraging inclusion to drive business results through greater innovation and synergy. It's important, because if we don't get that right, then I don't think it's going to stick, and it's not going to become a permanent part of the way businesses are operating. So with that, I'm going to step off of my soapbox for a second, because there are 5 things that I'm seeing that are not so great right now in this third wave. And third wave may not be the exact right way to phrase it, but that's my phrase. I am definitely seeing a tightening of budgets committed to DEI initiatives. Now, they're typically the budget tightening is kind of kept, hush hush. Nobody is announcing, nobody's sending out press releases saying, hey, we've reduced our commitment in this area by X millions of dollars. Instead, what's happening is when there are opportunities to replace a chief diversity officer with a director of diversity because someone has moved on, or when there are other opportunities that go kind of below the radar to reduce DEI budgets, I'm seeing organizations begin to take those opportunities. Now, it's not huge, there's not a huge contraction yet, but I've definitely in the last 6 months seen these contractions. At the same time, when I talked to DEI leaders about the scope of their responsibilities, there is an expanded mandate. So they're being asked to do more with less. They're being asked to have more of a business impact, but can you do it on a reduced budget, or can you do it with fewer resources? We're seeing tension between DEI constituents, meaning if I'm an African American employee and I see resources invested in these various groups, these various initiatives, does it feel like my needs, my issues, my priorities are getting lost in the mix? So there is a tension between DEI constituents, and I don't believe there's a right or wrong answer. I'm just acknowledging that tension exists, and we have to attend to that attention and and keep it, I guess, at the forefront of our thinking as we're looking at areas where we invest our time, our energy, our resources. In some cases, we are seeing a bit of DEI burnout. We are seeing organizations and individuals who feel like, okay, we've done that. There isn't anything new under the sun. And we're also starting to see some DEI detractors gaining ground. I think primarily because if I back up here, if our inclusive leaders aren't able to show tangible business results from their inclusive approach to leadership, if they aren't able to show the benefits of synergistic engagement with their employees, eventually the question is going to be asked, so what's in it for us? If we're going to continue to maintain our investments, continue to maintain our budgets, there's got to be a tangible business impact. There have to be metrics that we can look to say, here is the case. Here's the absolute case for DEI and inclusive leadership in our organization. So I do think these are brutal realities that we as DEI folks are going to have to continue to think through and ultimately solve. But the good news within that, I don't want to end on a bad note. So the good news is authentic inclusion is in fact becoming a business imperative. There are many organizations that I talk to who in fact are leading inclusively, are leading with an inclusive message, with an expanded message of inclusivity. There are many organizations who are very consciously not reducing their DEI budgets, who are tempted and are debating and discussing and ultimately absolutely staying true to the original intent of the commitments that they made in the wake of the George Floyd murder and what followed that. So there is a lot of good news in this third wave DEI, but I think we can't afford to just ignore the brutal reality. In fact, we have to think through how do we address the brutal reality, because if we don't do it, it's going to be done for us reactively. So with that, I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I'm going to, if you have questions or comments, particularly if it's something that you want me to respond to right now, because the chat is kind of flowing rapidly. So I'm going to look at the chat, but I'm going to look at the questions as well. If you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to respond to any of those before we wrap up. Not necessarily seeing any questions. Let me just quickly scroll through the chats here. So not seeing any. Let's look toward that. Not seeing any questions. So I'll share a couple of final thoughts and then we will wrap up. As I said, I have these conversations every week, at least 2 or 3 conversations with individuals who are in the trenches. They're actively within DEI initiatives within their organizations. What does Dan believe organizations should be doing right now? What is most immediate? So I'll give you my instinctive answer to that, because I tend to back away from what organizations should be doing right now and focus in on what should leaders be doing right now. Because I think sometimes what happens is when we talk about organizational issues, organizational mandates, it's very easy for individual leaders to let themselves off the hook. So I guess if there's any one thing that organizations should be doing right now is ensuring that inclusive leadership is part of their leadership messaging. I would say, number one, look to your existing leadership competency model as an organization and ask yourself, is inclusion viewed as a core leadership competency? However it's reflected, doesn't even matter what language you're using exactly, but is leadership inclusion part of your core competency? And if it's not, then do some work on that competency modeling and then once you do that, take a look at your entire organizational structure, your entire organization leadership, because inclusive leadership is not something that just springs up overnight. And it doesn't spring up in your leaders just because you tell them that it's now important to be an inclusive leader. It does require not e-learning. It doesn't require delivery of content. It requires engagement and dialogue and facilitation and a willingness to be vulnerable with leaders and help leaders themselves be vulnerable and acknowledge that some of their habits, some of their tendencies, and acknowledge that in the past we have rewarded and recognized those leaders who drive people forward and don't necessarily include others in the discussion, in the dialogue, in the process of making decisions. Let's see, I'm looking at the comments here. Your decade by decade breakdown was helpful. It was about social changes that affect the workplace. How do you suggest companies get engaged? I think it starts with the people that you're hiring and your customers as well. I think we're at a place in our world of work where companies exist as part of society, not as a separate entity over here. The days of an Ayn Randian view of capitalism, where companies exist to drive profit. That is still true. I mean, you've got to drive profit in order to exist, in order to continue to exist. But I think where our society is shifting is a view toward corporate entities as a part of our society with responsibilities to our society, and accepting that is critical and key to being a senior leader in today's world. I'm seeing a comment here. I work with a leader who has extreme biases in the senior management role. Would you have suggestions on how to get this through, as we have had multiple conversations on moving forward with the DEI structure and mindset? Hey, Rhiannon, I appreciate the question, and I would say, here's what I'm happy to do. I'm easy to find. Find me on LinkedIn. Message me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. And these are the kinds of conversations to have one-on-one, because every one of these situations is challenging, because cracking the code on those individual senior leaders and figuring out what is it really going to take to crack open this person versus this person. I don't necessarily have any great generic answers for that. I'm looking at Cheryl's comment or question. Organizations have always been pressed by social factors and changes. How do leaders, and should they, become more engaged in the social issues that challenge everyone in our real lives? So it's a fantastic question, because I do believe to be an inclusive leader, an effective inclusive leader, that answers the question that as an effective inclusive leader, you do have to, in fact, step forward into these social issues that are affecting our lives beyond the workplace. Old paradigm, I'm a leader in a business organization over a group of people with responsibilities for that group of people. And when I walk out the door, either in reality or metaphorically, I walk out the door and I can kind of set my work world aside and I can go to my personal world. I think a combination of things that have happened in the pandemic, where there's so much work from home occurring, so much remote work occurring, and maybe it's just our societal shift. To be an effective leader in today's world, you cannot disconnect yourself from the realities of society. And I think that's a part of the inclusive leadership message as well, that it's not simply a linear, I'll be more inclusive with this team of 8 people that report to me. I will be more inclusive with this society that I work within, with this world within I work within. And it is a new mindset for leaders. It's an overwhelming mindset for some leaders. I had a conversation with a gentleman 2 weeks ago. Great guy, on the older end of the spectrum, kind of a classic older white guy. And I mean that with respect, because speaking as an older white guy. And he said to me, for me, it comes down to this. When I was in the world of work and I was growing up in our business, I would have never talked to anyone about my mental health issues. In fact, he said, I didn't even think about my mental health issues myself. He said it was just not something you ever brought up. And then if you did bring it up, it was, when you needed some serious help in some way. He said, now I can't get people to shut up about their need for mental health days, about their need for bereavement, about their need for a break. And he said, I don't know how to have those conversations. He said, I will be honest with you, it scares me because I don't know what to say. I don't know how to react. I get worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing, or and so what I appreciated about his transparency with me was he was acknowledging. I mean, he had the self-awareness to recognize he wasn't necessarily judging them. He was saying, I am uncomfortable with this new way of being, with this new way of talking, with this new. But he said to me, I've still got another 8 to 10 years left in the workplace. I'm not retiring now, and I want to end strong in this last decade. So I know I've got to figure this out. I'm just not sure how to figure it out. What I loved about it was his willingness to put the question forward, his willingness to be vulnerable. Because if you'll do that, and I think it's one of the keys in helping leaders become more inclusive, is to help them become a little more vulnerable. I'm a little more willing to say, I don't have all of this figured out. I don't have all of the answers. And maybe just that openness itself will start to be part of the answer. I'm looking at other comments, questions. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're going to have, we've got just a few more minutes. So let's talk about DEI detractors, because the other thing that has shifted in the last 20 years is our societal communication media has now become so interconnected with social media. Whatever your particular bent may be, whether you are pro DEI, whether you're anti DEI, whether you're pro anything, you can be pro cooking or anti cooking, you can be pro anything or anti anything. You will very quickly find in social media a large group of people who think exactly the way you think right now. So DEI detractors very quickly find other DEI detractors and very quickly then form their own little sub-society, along with a 1,000 other sub-societies on virtually every topic in existence. And those DEI detractors do gain ground, and it's important, I think, that we not ignore them. I think you have to pay attention to their messaging and have to pay attention to their concerns and have to hear them in order to be able to combat them. And to combat them, I mean that in a respectful way. In order to counter message something, you have to understand the message itself. So I would say this tendency for all of us to reside in our own bubbles, it's another thing that an inclusive leader needs to fight. You have to push yourself outside of your bubble. So I don't know what each of you individually has your own information bubble that you reside in. And I would ask you to make a conscious effort to spend a little bit of time outside of your bubble, going into those areas of social media, those areas of the internet, those areas of reading. So don't just read the people who agree with you. I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure you can name the authors who disagree with you, who you can't imagine that there are a million people who would buy her book or his book. Every now and then, pick up one of their books. Every now and then, listen to some of their podcasts. Every now and then, tune into their news station or their radio station and give yourself an immersion. And you have to do it for more than just a single time, because what happens, I know what happens to me, is I will tune into a podcast and I will have asked myself, how is it that anybody can really want to spend time listening to this particular person or this particular topic? And initially, because it isn't the way I think, I initially reject it, and it doesn't provide me with entertainment. It doesn't really inform me, and I tend to want to shut it down. But I find if I'm willing to listen further, to answer the question, what are people hearing? What are people seeing? What is grabbing people about this messaging so that I can get smarter regarding their messaging in order to be smarter at the counter messaging, and to do it all with more a sense of curiosity than judgment, because it's so easy to buy into or to fall into the habit of saying, hey, the way I think is evolved, or the way I think is modern, the way I think is right, is smart. And so this other very different way of thinking, well, it must be wrong, and it must be not smart, and it must be stupid. So staying in that place of, I'm going to just curiously figure out what's pulling these folks in this direction. It makes me much smarter at counter messaging when I do understand the message, and I'm seeing the point here or the comment here. I read and engage with people who think nothing like me. I want to learn and always do better. Not one of us has all the answers. I will not, however, engage with trolls and those who are just trying to incite. Yeah, completely agree, absolutely. And recognizing the trolls whose actual intent is to create this incitement. Absolutely, you can recognize them and move on from them relatively quickly. So thanks, Trina, for sharing that. With that, I'm looking at the time. I think we are close to ready to conclude. Looking for any final comments or questions. The last thing I will share is I had a conversation with an individual 2 weeks ago. This was 3 weeks ago. And he had recently made a transition. He'd been in a DEI leadership role for one business, and he left that business and he moved and he took on a slightly more senior DEI leadership role for another business. And I asked him what motivated his transition to a new business, because I thought he was perfectly happy the way he where he was. Well, he said, our leadership, our DEI leadership in my old business, in their own way, they were sucking all the air out of the room. They had their message, and they were intent on delivering their message with passion. They were and they really weren't interested in other voices, in other perspectives, even within the DEI bubble, within our DEI landscape. He said, I was looking for a place where I could give voice to my thoughts, my ideas, my perspectives. And he said, my senior DEI leader is very passionate, is a fantastic person, has a great message, and essentially views his role as spreading his message throughout our organization, and views us as the minions who will deliver that message. And he said, the person I was speaking to said, I tried to have a conversation with him about how, in his own way, he was being exclusionary because he was limited to his passion, his intensity, his energy. And he said it didn't go anywhere. Really, I didn't get traction with that. And so then I started looking for an organization where I could express my voice. I could express my point of view. And what I thought was fascinating about that was how what he was really sharing was how easy it is as a leader to become exclusive. And so if you're going to be a truly inclusive leader, it's a never ending challenge. You're combating your own instincts to take control of the message. Inclusion, in some ways, in the corporate work world, doesn't come naturally, and it has to be an ongoing effort. So I'll leave it at that. Hey, thank you all for staying with this. It's been great to see that the participant number has kind of stayed current. So at least I didn't bore you for the last 60 minutes. So very much appreciated. And now I'm going to turn things back to hr.com.
Thanks, Dan. This concludes our webcast today. I would like to thank our presenter as well as all of you for joining us. If you joined late and would like to review the webcast again, the recording and slides will be available on hr.com on our archived webcast page. Please take a few moments and fill out the webcast survey that will open on your screen. Your feedback is very important to us. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of the event.